And joining us now on the debate from Washington, D.C., Ronald Newman, former U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan. Also in Washington, Sam Zarifi, research director with Human Rights Watch. In Ottawa, Fen Hampson, he is director of the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs. And here in studio, TVO's own international affairs analyst, there's Janice Stein. Janice, good to see you again. And for our friends Points Beyond, thank you for joining us today. I want to start by reading something that Paddy Ashdown, the former politician from the UK, wrote in The Guardian a few months back. He wrote, "In July 2006, Britain's highly respected commander of international forces in Afghanistan, General David Richards, issued a stark warning. Afghanistan is a good and winnable war, but at the pace we are proceeding, we need to realize that we could actually fail here. A year on, as yesterday's Defense Committee report of July 18 indicates, we are indeed beginning to fail in Afghanistan." Ambassador Newman, I want to start with you. Do you think things have deteriorated as much as the British Defense Committee's report suggests?
No, but I think there are reasons for serious concern. The military situation is still more one of a weak government than a strong insurgency, and I think there are parts of the country where we're doing quite well, others where we're much more stretched, but NATO does not have enough troops. But I think General Richards' original comment, and I worked very closely with David Richards, is still valid, although the timeline is longer. This is still winnable if we don't just give up on it and walk away.
Sam Zarifi, how about you on that?
Well, the question for Human Rights Watch is never whether one side or the other is going to win, but rather what are conditions for Afghans. And what we hear from Afghans today is what we've heard for the past 6 years. They want international assistance. They are aware that without international assistance, their lives will degenerate once again to the misery that they faced. The problem is that the insurgency, the narco-trafficking, the lack of governance that we've seen has deteriorated in much of Afghanistan, and we've seen a lot of Afghans suffering more in the last year than they did at any time since the U.S. ousted the Taliban. But overall, the Afghans want international assistance, and overall, they seem confident that if they get enough international assistance, and that's a key question, whether they will get enough international assistance, that they are able to turn their country around.
All right, Fen Hampson, let me try this with you. The most interesting and I guess fascinating recent development was the olive branch extended by the head of Afghanistan, Mr. Karzai, to the Taliban. What did you make of that?
Well, I was somewhat surprised by it. I suspect that he was responding to some of the pressure that he's been getting from some of the countries who are in there to try to get some traction around a political process that can help with the security situation. I suspect it was done sort of looking, in some ways, looking to one side, because it's hard to see how we could have a serious negotiation right now between the Karzai government and the Taliban, which, as we all know, is a highly divided and rather fractious entity.
Janice, what's your view on that?
I actually think that this was a Karzai initiative. In fact, some of the NATO members are quite resistant to it. These negotiations have been going on behind the scenes for quite a while. At low levels, at higher levels. Some of the lower levels are tribal elders. Some of the higher levels come from neighboring countries. I'm not surprised because, in fact, negotiation is so much a part of Pashtun culture. You negotiate and you fight at the same time.
Except that we're told we don't negotiate with terrorists. So
yeah,
but
in fact, almost every government formally says that and then proceeds to do exactly the opposite when their own direct interests are at stake. I think Fen's point about the highly fractious and divided Taliban is a really important point. But the offer to negotiate is in fact designed to split off those members of the Taliban going up through the ranks right to the highest levels who are seriously interested in negotiation. And there are in fact some splits and some factions that are signaling they really are interested.
Let me get the former ambassador on that. Ambassador Newman, what did you make of that offer to potentially negotiate with the Taliban?
Well, I do think it is a genuine Karzai offer. President Karzai and I have talked about this situation often in the past, so this is not new. I think the last comment made about splitting off those who are willing to change is right on the money. I think it is very important to be clear about both what I understand President Karzai to be offering, and I think what we, the American government, or I used to represent them, feel comfortable about. And that is, what he is offering is a way for people to come in out of the cold and join the existing political process, constitutional system without fear of retribution. I do not understand him to be offering to negotiate a fundamental realignment of politics, that is, allowing the Taliban as an institution to take some share of power by force. I don't think he's offering that. I don't think it's doable, and I think it would be a huge mistake. But I think since people use this word negotiate to cover a lot of different things, one needs to be clear about both what's on offer and what should be acceptable.
Well, Fan Hampson, the reply from the Taliban, I gather, was, sure, we're interested as soon as every foreign troop is gone.
Right.
What kind of a response is that?
Well, it's a wait-and-see response, and it also, I think, reflects some of the internal differences within the Taliban. I think we also have to recognize that Karzai just doesn't speak for himself. He speaks for an alliance of interests, and one of the questions I would have is, can he deliver his coalition to the negotiation if this really gets traction? Because the Taliban is not popular with large sectors of Afghani society. I think it's also an issue of timing. I mean, to be sure, it's fair to say that as Janice said, this is a culture that in some ways is based on negotiation, and the issue is, you know, what exactly are they going to negotiate over? But you know, we're also talking about timing. I mean, is Karzai making this overture from a position of strength, or is it from weakness?
And what's the answer to that?
And I think the answer is it's from weakness, because as we've seen in several UN reports, the security situation is worsening. The terrorist attacks, the Taliban campaign has extended from the south to other parts of the country.
Well, let me ask Sam Zarifi this then. Do you look at it as a bit of an act of desperation, as some have characterized it, by President Karzai?
Well, President Karzai has made overtures like this actually in the past, and they've similarly been rejected. I think a real question that our Afghan colleagues ask us is, what is on the table for negotiation? Is President Karzai going to compromise on some of the principles of government? Is he going to provide some of the ideological issues that the Taliban are interested in? Is he going to kick girls out of school or women out of the workplace? And I think those are no-go areas. Or is he going to create essentially, you know, or provide regional fiefdoms to the Taliban and essentially allow them to become another set of warlords? Both of those are really unacceptable by most Afghans. They've seen that in the past. They don't like it. They're not happy in the areas under Taliban control right now. So I think President Karzai has a very short-term political gain in mind, possibly because of a weak position right now. But I don't think it's really feasible. It's possible that some Taliban may come in from the cold, but on the whole, the part of this negotiation or the strategy that's missing is a very strong NATO and U.S. resolve supporting President Karzai to allow him to engage in real discussions about peace from a position of strength, and that's absolutely lacking right now.
Well, could I make another point?
Sure.
You know, one of the things we've learned from other peace processes is that the negotiations that work and get traction are those where the parties are deadlocked. They've been deadlocked for quite some time. And as we know from a lot of social science work, you've sort of passed the 5-year mark, which in this case, this particular phase of the Afghan conflict has done. But by the same token, if the Taliban is actually making some gains, the question I would have is, why would they want to come to the negotiation table in a serious way? If they see Karzai being somewhat on the ropes, facing the prospect of some NATO countries withdrawing their troops in a year and a half time. Again, what's in it for them other than to curry some legitimacy, which in any negotiation is important. And I think, you know, that if they do come to the table, that's what they would be looking for. When you say you're going to sit down, that does legitimize the interests of the other side. And I think, as your commentator from Washington just pointed out, there are a lot of apprehensions about the kinds of demands that the Taliban are bringing to the table.
Okay, Janice?
You know, I think it's important to put the security situation in the broader picture here. If you actually look at the number of violence incidents, they've gone up in 2007. But in fact, the Taliban are unable really to take and hold territory. They are not able to mass the kind of numbers that they were in 2006.
They can be a successful insurgency, though.
You can be a successful insurgency really based on IEDs, unexploded devices, on suicide bombers, and that, in fact, has been spreading beyond the epicenter of it. But in fact, I think it's misleading to say that Karzai is weaker now from the security perspective than he was a year and a half ago. I don't think that's true. I think, secondly, there is actually something on offer to the Taliban. It's beyond just simply saying to individual members of the Taliban, come into the existing situation. There is an openness to having the Taliban as a group come into discussions, and that does, as Sam said, raise apprehensions among some Afghans. What is not at stake for Karzai is the overall order. What is at stake? Are there some concessions that can be made on religious issues, on religious observance? Right at the epicenter of this kind of discussion, what happens to girls in schools? These are all big issues. But it's more than just a reach out to individual soft Taliban members who join up for the money and then come back to harvest their crops.
I want to ask a bit of an odd question to a former diplomat, and that goes to you, Ambassador Newman. We've just come out of an interview with Ed Luttwak, whom I suspect you know, or at least know of, in the United States. And he said during his interview, talking about the Middle East, that the West should ignore it, basically, and bring on the civil war, because civil war brings, eventually, civil peace. Now, everybody hates war, but what do you think of that prescription?
Well, keeping the discussion in Afghanistan,
exactly, for Afghanistan,
I hope you wanted to do.
Yes.
No, I think that's a disaster, because what you're talking, and I think when you talk about the question you introduced this discussion with about Canada and its role, I think it's important to think about just what the stakes are here. If the international and Afghan effort to establish a stable government fails, then there is no strongman, army, dictator, or coalition ready to govern Afghanistan. The result is fragmentation, a huge psychological victory for extreme forces located next to tribal areas in Pakistan, near new states in Central Asia. This is major, major instability, very large psychological victory for radical forces. And to give it all up because it's a little worse and a few people, tragically enough, get killed, but a lot more get killed in our highways and in drunk driving and a lot of things we put up with, and just to say, oh, we can't do it anymore. This is to, I think, lose a very big stake for quite insufficient reasons or for short-term gains and calculations.
Steve,
there are still a substantial number of Afghans with us. You can't go back. You can't let this play out. And no, I think you get the wrong winners if we pull out. Now, I would also say just quickly that Karzai is not as on the ropes as some of people are saying. Taliban, or insurgents, not just Taliban, are doing rather badly in the East. We're doing much better there than the South, where the Canadian British have come lately to a harder situation. But even in the South, there are definite indications of discontent among Taliban leaders, a lot of whom have been killed. There's been a pretty careful effort to do that on purpose.
Okay, hold that thought for a second, Ambassador. I think I heard Sam trying to get in as well.
Just to follow on what Ambassador Newman was saying, and putting aside the geopolitics of it, look, there are 25 to 30 million people in Afghanistan whose lives are already really on the edge. Afghanistan is one of the poorest countries on the planet. Female literacy is 12%. Infant mortality is one of the highest ever recorded. Maternal mortality is one of the highest ever recorded. This is not a country that has a huge margin for accepting another wave of major conflict, which is what a civil war would be. So there is no mood among Afghans for this. But again, to just put a human face on the geopolitics, we have seen this conflict spill over onto the Pakistan tribal areas. Now, think about, there are millions of people who are living in that border area. There are millions of Pashtuns in Pakistan. There are more Pashtuns in Pakistan than there are in Afghanistan. And what we see among them is also tremendously high maternal mortality, very low literacy, especially for girls. These are areas that are, truly awful in terms of human security and human development. And they've all gotten worse over the last couple of years as the Taliban have increased their operations in those areas.
This is one of the things I want to follow up on. This is one of the things I want to follow up on because I want to show you some numbers here. The views of the Taliban. Now, admittedly, these numbers go back a bit here to 2006. And Janice, I'm going to ask you in a second how much things have changed. But here was the view of the Taliban when surveyed by the Program on International Policy Attitudes in January of 2006. 8% of those surveyed had a favorable view of the Taliban, 88% an unfavorable view. And what was their view on the overthrow of the Taliban? 82% thought it was a good thing, only 11% thought it was a bad thing. Janice, when you were there recently, do these numbers still jibe?
I think those numbers are more or less right. You certainly get some variation in the South, and we've just actually commissioned a new survey. The results will be out in 3 weeks, which actually surveys Afghan attitudes toward the Taliban and breaks it out by the Pashtun in the South. So it'll be quite interesting to get the results. But every poll that I've seen, and some done by Afghans who actually have the capability to do it on the ground, overwhelming majority are, one, opposed to the return of the Taliban, and two, glad that the Taliban were ousted. There's a third question, though, which, and this is an interesting one when it's asked, what do you think of foreign forces? And support for the presence of foreign forces has dropped as the number of civilian casualties caught in airstrikes or artillery fire has risen. So at the one hand, there's much more suspicion of foreign forces. On the other hand, no support virtually or very limited outside the Pashtun areas for the return of the Taliban.
Well, in which case, Finn Hampson, how is it that this group, which seems to be so despised by so many people, is still such a player and so influential?
Well, I think there are two questions that have to be asked, and one is not obviously the support for the Taliban, because the Taliban is quite amorphous and it means different things to different people, but also what's happening to the support for the Karzai government. And there, again, some of the polling that I've seen suggests that its own legitimacy and popularity has been eroding rather dramatically, in part because of problems with the security forces, the police forces in particular, which are corrupt and in some cases are more feared by the local population than they fear the Taliban, for that matter. But also problems with governance, problems with the whole development enterprise. It is a mixed picture, and it's a very complicated picture. But some of the key indicators do suggest that things are not going well. I'd also like to comment, since you began the segment with Ed Luttwak's observation that the best thing to do in these kinds of situations is to, in effect, walk away and let them burn. And in some ways, that's the debate we're having
well, in
right
fairness
here
to him, he didn't say let them burn. He didn't say let them burn.
No, but that's basically the implication. Let the fires of civil war burn themselves out, which is another variation of that. And I think that's a very dangerous argument. We've seen the problems in Afghanistan historically of letting it be an orphan of the international community. I mean, that's what happened in after 1979, after the Russians were thrown out, 80, you know, returning to the status quo ante is simply not a viable option for all kinds of reasons that we're all too familiar with.
Okay, having said that, I want to go to the former ambassador, Ronald Newman, on this one. Critics of the situation in Afghanistan are pointing to a few things. They're saying too few boots on the ground, no unity of command, U.S. Special Forces and CIA operations operated out of Washington rather than operated there, and they are asking whether anybody has the will or the power to deal with all of this. How would you answer that observation?
There is a fair amount of truth in the criticism. NATO does not have enough troops on the ground, although it has more now than it had a year ago. And it is true that nations like Canada and the Dutch and the British are bearing a somewhat disproportionate load, although I think people need to remember that you've got small nations, much smaller, who are also in the, not just present, but fighting, Danes, Romanians, Poles.
Dutch.
So you're not alone. Dutch, very, very much.
Absolutely.
And that it's important not to get so seized with the people who are not doing as much as one wants that one forgets that one has friends. But I would also say, you know, draw a deep breath. Remember that every alliance warfare in history has been fraught with these kind of problems. We won World War II, and we had at least as many disagreements. You know, we can get better. We probably won't get perfect. We don't have unity of command, but that's partly because no nation wants to fully subordinate its own goals, including Canada or Britain or America. So you can get better. We've gotten better over the last year, but we've got a long way to go. I don't think we should try to hide the things that need fixing, but I don't think we should despair of the fact that alliance warfare is always a tale of mutual recrimination, to borrow a phrase from Churchill.
Okay, let me put this to Sam Zarifi for a second here. This was an excerpt I'm going to read from this magazine from earlier this year, and it goes like this. Afghanistan has been ripped apart by decades of war which turned ethnic, tribal, religious, and political groups against each other, and in rural areas people continue to live in much the same conditions as they have for hundreds of years. It will take perhaps generations, plural, for Afghanistan to recover and advance, but that desperately needed transformation can only come about through strengthening domestic institutions and civil society, a process that depends on international support, which at present requires a military component. Sam, do you think Afghanistan can be turned around?
I think there's no question about it. When we've traveled through Afghanistan, what we've seen is, in those instances when Afghans have received sufficient assistance from their own government, from the international community, they have managed to turn things around. And there are pockets of stability and even progress throughout Afghanistan that are amazing to see. You know, even in the south, in Ghazni, there are areas where we traveled last year where schools are flourishing and people are able to really move forward in their lives. And that's because they feel secure and they have received sufficient support. And very importantly, their local government structure is healthy. One of the big mistakes that I think the U.S. made especially, and President Karzai has continued, is this idea that if you have a big tent and if you bring in some of the worst militia leaders and warlords, that you will have things improve. And I think, as one of the commentators already suggested, for a lot of Afghans, when they talk about insecurity and what they're afraid of, they're not talking about Taliban. They're talking about their local warlord, who is frequently a member of the police or maybe a member of parliament or a governor, and is raping them and pillaging them. But we have seen Afghans move forward, and remember, Afghanistan per capita has received so much less support financially and militarily than recent post-conflict situations in the Balkans and East Timor.
Well, that gets back to my original question. Where's the commitment?
To see,
Where's the commitment?
Well,
where's the will?
that's exactly what has been missing, I think, from what the international community has done. You know, the United States did not have security forces in southern Afghanistan, ever. It only had special forces who were looking for al-Qaeda and not protecting the lives of Afghans until Canadians moved in.
Okay, let me get Janice Stein in here. Hang on a second, Sam.
It's
Go ahead,
really
Jan.
interesting because people talk a great deal about the abject state of governance in Afghanistan. Local governance in Afghanistan is terrific. At the local level, there are 16,000 village councils all across Afghanistan.
Yeah, but Janice says, you know, that's true in the northern part of the country. It's not true in the southern part of the country.
It's actually
and the evidence.
No, it's actually true to some degree in the southern part of the country. There are over 500 now.
In a very limited way, and I think it's important not to oversell the success stories. I mean, you know. We keep talking about turning around Afghanistan. Well, turning it around to what precisely?
Well, but that's
it's you know, we keep thinking that it's going to be you know, Western-style democracy. Our leaders keep sort of.
Okay, hang on, Fen. Let her finish the thought.
That's in fact what I was trying to say. That when we talk about the abject state of governance, we're looking at it through Western eyes, with Western models.
Absolutely.
In fact, in the South, there are local village councils, tribal councils, that meet, that make decisions about schools, about wells. And when, in fact, you go to one of those meetings, you see exactly what Sam was talking about. Huge interest in building local infrastructure. You know, a school, a clinic, that sort of thing. Remarkable ability to have a conversation and settle differences in these villages. Stuff actually happens all the time. It's as you move up the chain that there are these huge gaps. The single biggest problem in Afghanistan is actually not the lack of boots on the ground. The biggest problem in Afghanistan right now is the police. And that's probably...
Meaning whose side are they on, or what?
Whose side are they on, exactly.
Well, I mentioned that earlier.
And in fact, if we look at where the big failure of NATO has been in the international community, it's not been the boots on the ground. It's been, they dropped the ball in a big way on the police force. Germany particularly was charged with it. They did something in the summer of 2006 was lunacy. They took militias that were already armed and inducted them as an auxiliary police force. That's the biggest problem in Afghanistan right now, probably the highest priority. Well, but it's not that there's no governance.
Yeah, no, and I think our own government has recognized that when they took a decision recently to start paying the police themselves directly. No, I wouldn't disagree with that.
Okay, Fen, let me jump in for a second, because we're down to our last 5 minutes, and I do want to get you to comment on the big development that happened today, and that was the naming of a panel headed by John Manley, the former Liberal foreign minister of the country, deputy prime minister at one time, to consider 4 options. I'll read them quickly. Continue training the Afghan army and police so Canada can begin withdrawing its forces in Feb 2009. Focus on reconstruction and have another country take over security in Kandahar. Shift Canadian security and reconstruction efforts to another region. Or withdraw all Canadian military except a minimal force to protect aid workers and diplomats. Those are the 4 questions, the 4 options the Prime Minister wants this panel to consider. Are they the right 4 options to be considering?
Well, yes, but that constrains the problem quite narrowly. I mean, the fact is, I mean, I think the creation of the panel, you know, is a brilliant political move. It in effect punts the problem into the neutral zone, at least for the time being, and it buys this government some political time. But you know, the options are obvious. Do you stay? Do you leave? Or do you withdraw gradually? I think the real question is, what are we trying to do in Afghanistan? What is the end game in Afghanistan? And this panel is going to have its work cut out for it, because we're in a fast-changing strategic environment. There's going to be a new president in the White House just at about the time that we're considering withdrawing our forces. I don't think we can underestimate how that is going to change the optic, not just around the Iraqi mission, but also
forgive me again for jumping in, but we're really tight on time, and I want to hear former Ambassador Newman on this. The options that Canada is now considering, give us some advice here. The Prime Minister's put this group together. What do you think?
Well, I think it's very good to have a mixed group take a look at this. I hope they do it, as I expect they will, in a thorough fashion. I wasn't quite sure, as I was trying to listen to the options, whether the real world presents quite such finite choices.
I agree.
I think I think we have to grow a government and we have to do development. But if you pull out and there isn't somebody else to do the job, then the Taliban will destroy what you build. So that's not an option. Yes, we need to pick up the ball in the police. I totally agree. But the way to do that is to both provide more protection and for countries to provide more trainers and more mentors to work with them at a lower level. It's not just pay.
Let me get Janice Stein here. 2 minutes to go here. Janice, can you tell me, are these the 4 right questions, and are there other options they should be considering?
Well, it's really interesting. What's so interesting about these 4 questions, Steve, is what's not on the list. Okay. What's not on the list is leaving our combat forces in Kandahar province. That's not there, right? If you actually go down that list of options, it's training, it's development, it's a version of PRT, it's redeployment, but in
PRT, Provincial Reconstruction Team,
which we have in Kandahar, which is separate from our combat deployment, but among those 4 options is not renewing the combat mission. What's interesting about this, the Prime Minister has taken that off the table, even before the Commission gets into the field.
So what do you infer from that?
I think the Prime Minister is signaling that we are withdrawing our combat forces in February 2009.
Do you think he means it, or do you think this is a different kind of a thing?
Well, we are in the midst, as Sven was saying, of a very heated political environment, and certainly this moves us down the track until the end of January. Very short timeline on this Commission, very short.
Yeah, they got to report end of January
the
next year.
The latest by the end of January, and that option is not on the table.
Last minute, who wanted to...
If I could just 1 minute, if only those 4 options are considered, if that is really a correct interpretation, then you have just handed the Taliban a major psychological victory.
Well, no, in fairness, the Prime Minister said, these are the 4 things I want you to study, but it doesn't take away from any other options that you want to add.
That's excellent.
Because
look, just to be clear also, and again, just to emphasize this, I think there is no question that what we need right now from Canada and the rest of NATO is a clear sense of resolution. They have to say that they're going to stay and they're going to do this right. There are several things to criticize, but none of them are their engagement with it. 2009 is supposed to see another round of elections in Afghanistan. It's going to be a particularly important political time if we want anything to come of what we've spent so far and the lives that have been lost in Afghanistan by NATO troops. I think it is essentially irresponsible at this point to consider pulling out combat troops and weakening the military spine that is so necessary for the political and reconstruction work that the Afghan people want from the international community.
You're going to get the last word on this one then. That's Sam Zarifi from Human Rights Watch out of town. Former Ambassador Ronald Newman, we thank you both very much for being on the line from Washington. Fen Hampson from Carleton University in Ottawa, Janice Stein here in studio. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.